A billionaire's empire, a pregnant wife's desperate escape, and a divorce deposition that was supposed to be a quiet, formal affair. What happens when a man who has everything, a man who controls markets and manipulates media, finally loses control for one fateful second? The answer was caught on a tiny, almost invisible camera lens hidden in plain sight. But the real story isn't the act itself. It's what one unshakable judge decided to do with that explosive footage. His verdict wouldn't be whispered in law books. It would be broadcast into millions of homes, igniting a national firestorm, and proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't wealth or influence, but the simple, undeniable truth. Jonathan Blackwood didn't just live in a penthouse, he occupied a stratosphere. His apartment, a glass and chrome palace crowning one of Chicago's tallest skyscrapers, offered a god's-eye view of the city. From the 92nd floor, the bustling streets became silent, orderly lines of light, the chaos of humanity reduced to an elegant, predictable pattern. This was how Jonathan saw the world, a complex system to be observed, understood, and ultimately controlled. His life was a monument to this philosophy. Blackwood Technologies, the company he'd built from a garage startup into a global behemoth, was a testament to his ruthless efficiency and foresight. His suits were bespoke, his watches were marvels of Swiss engineering, and his wife, Olivia Hayes, was to the outside world the most beautiful and perfect of all his acquisitions. Olivia knew she was seen this way. At first, she had been captivated by Jonathan's ambition, the sheer force of his will that seemed to bend reality around him. He had courted her with the same intensity he applied to a corporate takeover, relentless, strategic, and overwhelmingly persuasive. She was a promising art historian, a curator at a boutique gallery, and he had celebrated her passion-funding exhibitions and buying her rare books. He made her feel seen. But over their 5 years of marriage, she had come to understand that being seen by Jonathan was like being an insect pinned under glass. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a masterpiece, to hang on his wall, a reflection of his own impeccable taste. The control started subtly. It was a suggestion that the dress she'd chosen for a gala was a bit too provincial. It was the helpful hiring of a personal assistant who managed her schedule so thoroughly that lunches with her old friends like Penelope Vance were perpetually rescheduled. It was the casual way he'd dismiss her career. "It's a lovely hobby, darling," he'd say, smiling for the cameras at some charity event, his hand a firm, proprietary weight on the small of her back. "It keeps her busy." Each word was a tiny, polished stone, slowly building a wall around her, isolating her in their gilded cage. The pregnancy was supposed to be a moment of shared joy. When Olivia told him, her hands trembling as she held up the positive test, Jonathan's reaction was not one of warmth, but of triumphant satisfaction. "A boy," he declared, not asked. "He'll be the heir. Blackwood and Son. It has a good ring to it." He kissed her forehead, a perfunctory gesture, before his eyes drifted back to the stock ticker, glowing on the massive screen in their living room. For Olivia, the confirmation of a new life growing inside her was not a triumph, but a terrifying clarification. This wasn't just her life anymore. She couldn't raise a child in this sterile, loveless environment where affection was a transaction and emotions were liabilities. She pictured a little boy or girl trying to win the approval of a man who measured love in stock points and public perception. The thought was a physical pain sharper than any morning sickness. That was the moment the vague notion of leaving solidified into a desperate, non-negotiable plan. The last straw came not with a shout, but with a quiet act of annihilation. Olivia had spent months curating a special exhibition for a brilliant but unknown sculptor. It was her passion project, a chance to reclaim a piece of her own identity. The opening night was a success. The gallery was buzzing, critics were impressed, and for the first time in years, Olivia felt a spark of her old self. Jonathan arrived late, trailed by a phalanx of business associates. He surveyed the room with an owner's gaze, nodding curtly at the gallerist. He walked over to Olivia, who was glowing with pride. "Excellent turnout," he said, his voice a low murmur, meant only for her. He gestured with his chin towards the sculptor, a wiry, earnest young man, talking animatedly about his work. "How much did you pay for this hobby of yours to get a feature?" Olivia's smile froze. "What are you talking about? I didn't pay him. This is his art, his talent." Jonathan chuckled a dry, dismissive sound. "Right. Talent. Darling, everything and everyone has a price. You just have to know what it is." He then turned to one of his associates, a man named Henderson. "Henderson, buy the big piece in the center. The ugly metal one. We'll write it off as a donation. It'll be good for the company's image, supporting the local arts." He walked away, leaving Olivia standing there hollowed out. He hadn't just insulted her work, he had fundamentally misunderstood it, and her in the most profound way possible. He saw her passion not as something real, but as another asset to be leveraged, another line item on his vast balance sheet. The art, the artist, her joy, it was all just another commodity. In that moment, surrounded by the very things that gave her life meaning, she had never felt more invisible. The beautiful penthouse wasn't a home, it was a showroom, and she was the primary exhibit. The next morning, while Jonathan was in a board meeting, reshaping the future of telecommunications, Olivia Hayes made a phone call that would begin the process of reshaping her own. The name Genevieve Croft was not one you'd find on flashy billboards or in glossy magazine ads. Her firm, Croft & Associates, occupied a discreet but elegant brownstone in a quieter part of the city, far from the gleaming towers of corporate law. Genevieve was known in certain circles as the person you called when you needed to extricate yourself from a powerful, dangerous man. She was a surgeon of the law known for her precision, her discretion, and her complete lack of intimidation in the face of immense wealth and influence. When Olivia called, her voice was a strained whisper, terrified that the very walls of her penthouse were listening. Genevieve's assistant put her through immediately. Genevieve's voice was calm, a steady, low anchor in Olivia's swirling panic. "Tell me everything, Mrs. Blackwood, from the beginning." And Olivia did. She spoke for nearly an hour, the words tumbling out in a torrent of long-suppressed frustrations and fears. She spoke of the subtle humiliations, the financial control, the suffocating isolation, and the chilling realization that her pregnancy had sealed her fate as a permanent fixture in Jonathan's collection. Genevieve listened without interruption, her silence not empty, but attentive. When Olivia finished exhausted and raw, Genevieve's first words were not of legal strategy, but of validation. "Olivia," she said, dropping the formal Mrs. Blackwood with deliberate kindness, "none of this is your fault, and you are right to be afraid, but you are also right to be brave." Their first meeting was a clandestine affair worthy of a spy novel, Olivia claiming a spa day. One of the few solo activities Jonathan approved of was dropped off by her driver. She waited 5 minutes before exiting through a back door and taking a pre-arranged cab to a small cafe 2 blocks from Genevieve's office. Her best friend, Penelope Vance, was waiting there, a familiar, comforting face in a sea of terrifying uncertainty. It was Penelope who walked with her to the brownstone, a silent show of solidarity. Genevieve Croft was exactly as her voice had promised, a fortress of calm competence. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a presence that was both reassuring and formidable. Her office was filled with books, not awards, and the air smelled of old paper and strong tea. "Jonathan Blackwood will not make this easy." Genevieve stated, her fingers steepled on her mahogany desk. "Men like him don't see divorce as the end of a relationship. They see it as a hostile takeover. They believe they can win because they have always won. He will use his money to hire the best, most ruthless lawyers. He will try to paint you as an unstable, hysterical gold digger. He will use your pregnancy against you, claiming you're unfit. We need to be 10 steps ahead." The plan they forged was meticulous. Genevieve explained that Jonathan controlled all their joint assets. The moment he was served with divorce papers, he would freeze every account, leaving Olivia penniless and vulnerable. The first step was to create a war chest. Over the next 3 weeks, Olivia, following Genevieve's careful instructions, began to siphon off funds. She used the cashback option at grocery stores, taking the maximum amount each time. She sold a few pieces of jewelry. Jonathan had given her pieces without significant sentimental value that wouldn't be immediately missed to a discreet, private buyer, Genevieve knew. She compiled a dossier of documents, bank statements she secretly photographed with her phone, copies of deeds and stock certificates. She found in Jonathan's home office a log of his controlling and verbally abusive remarks, complete with dates and times. Every action was a small rebellion, a quiet chipping away at the foundation of her prison. Penelope was her lifeline, a co-conspirator in the fight for her freedom. She helped Olivia secure a small, unassuming apartment in a different neighborhood under her own name, paid for 6 months in advance with the cash Olivia had accumulated. They furnished it sparsely with second-hand items, creating a safe haven that was the complete antithesis of the cold, opulent penthouse. It was small, it was anonymous, and it was hers. The day Genevieve's process server finally delivered the divorce papers to Jonathan at his gleaming office tower, the fallout was instantaneous and brutal. Olivia was at the new apartment, having told Jonathan she was visiting an ailing aunt out of state. Her phone exploded with texts from him. They began as confused, then quickly escalated to furious. "What is the meaning of this joke? Call me immediately." "You are making the biggest mistake of your life, Olivia." Then came the call. She let it go to voicemail. His voice, when she listened to it later, was a low, menacing snarl that chilled her to the bone. "You think you can just walk away with my child? You have nothing. You are nothing without me. I will burn everything you have to the ground. You will not see a single cent, and you will certainly never see our son. I will prove you are an unfit mother. I will own you." The threat was clear. This wasn't about love or heartbreak. It was about possession. He had lost control of an asset, and he would deploy his entire arsenal to reclaim it. As Genevieve had predicted, within an hour, Olivia's credit cards were declined. The joint bank account was emptied. She was officially cut off. But sitting on the floor of her modest secret apartment, with her small bag of essentials and the dossier of evidence, Olivia didn't feel broken. She felt a terror, yes, but underneath it, a fierce, unfamiliar flicker of power. The game had begun, and for the first time, Jonathan Blackwood was not the only one with a strategy. The deposition was scheduled to take place in a neutral territory, a conference room at a high-end legal mediation center. The room was designed to be calming, with its beige walls, polished mahogany table, and muted abstract art. But on that overcast Tuesday morning, the air within it was electric with hostility, thick and suffocating. Jonathan Blackwood arrived flanked by his legal team, led by the formidable Walter Finch. Finch was a legend in corporate litigation, a silver-haired shark known for his ability to dismantle witnesses with surgical precision and a condescending smile. Jonathan himself looked impeccable in a dark navy suit, his face a mask of cold fury. He refused to look at Olivia, who sat opposite him, a visible baby bump, now pressing against her simple black dress. Beside her, Genevieve Croft was an oasis of composure, her files arranged neatly, her posture relaxed but alert. The purpose of the deposition was discovery for Finch's team to question Olivia, and for Genevieve to question Jonathan, all under oath. Finch began his tone, dripping with false sympathy. He spent 2 hours attempting to weave a narrative of Olivia as a manipulative freeloader. "Mrs. Blackwood, isn't it true that before you met my client, you were earning a modest salary of less than $50,000 a year? Isn't it true that Mr. Blackwood funded the very gallery where you worked, effectively paying your salary? Isn't it true that you never once expressed any unhappiness in the marriage until after you became pregnant with what you knew would be his heir?" Olivia coached extensively, but Genevieve answered each question calmly and truthfully. Yes, my salary was modest. Yes, he was a benefactor of the gallery, along with many other patrons. No, that is not true. I expressed my unhappiness to Jonathan many times. Jonathan watched a smirk playing on his lips. He was enjoying the spectacle, confident in Finch's ability to shred his wife's credibility. When it was Genevieve's turn to question Jonathan, the atmosphere shifted. Genevieve's approach was different. She didn't attack him head-on. She started with his business, asking seemingly innocuous questions about the early days of Blackwood Technologies. She brought up his first failed startup, a dot-com bust from the late 90s. Finch objected. "Finch, relevance, Ms. Croft. I am establishing a pattern of Mr. Blackwood's behavior when faced with situations he cannot control." Genevieve replied smoothly, her eyes locked on Jonathan. Jonathan's smirk faltered. He hated being reminded of that failure. It was the one blemish on his carefully constructed myth of invincibility. Genevieve then moved to his personal life, probing his relationship with his own father, a steel worker who had viewed his son's corporate ambitions with disdain. "Objection," Finch snapped. "This is a fishing expedition." "On the contrary," Genevieve said, her voice dropping slightly. "It speaks to Mr. Blackwood's deep-seated need for control, a need that has manifested in his treatment of my client." She turned back to Jonathan. "Jonathan, you provided Olivia with a weekly allowance, correct? Even though she was your wife, and the money was by law marital property. I managed our finances. She's fiscally irresponsible," he sneered. "Is that why you liquidated the joint account containing over $2 million the day you were served, leaving your pregnant wife with no access to funds for prenatal care or basic living expenses?" Jonathan's knuckles turned white where he gripped the edge of the table. "She has her little art fund. She can sell her trinkets." The venom in his voice was palpable. Genevieve saw the crack in his composure and knew it was time. She leaned forward, her expression turning from professional inquiry to one of profound pity. "It must be difficult for you, Jonathan," she said, her voice soft but carrying a sharp edge. "To have built an empire on predicting and controlling every outcome, only to be faced with the one thing you can never truly own, another person's heart. And now a child who will have a will of its own, a mind of its own, who might not revere you, who might in fact see you for exactly what you are." That was it, the final fatal blow to his narcissistic ego. The idea that his own child, his heir, might not worship him was anathema. Jonathan's mask of civility didn't just crack, It shattered. He shot to his feet, the heavy chair scraping violently against the floor. "You!" he roared, his finger stabbing the air toward Olivia. "You did this. You and your ambulance-chasing bitch of a lawyer. You think you can poison my own son against me. You are nothing. A piece of arm candy I picked up at a gallery. You will have nothing, and you will give me my son." Olivia flinched her hands, instinctively going to her belly. The movement, so protective and so defiant, seemed to enrage him further. He took a step around the table, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage. Walter Finch, for the first time in his career, looked genuinely alarmed. "Jonathan, sit down." But Jonathan didn't hear him. His world had narrowed to Olivia's defiant face. In one swift, shocking motion, he lunged forward and slapped her hard across the cheek. The crack of flesh on flesh echoed in the stunned silence of the room. A bright red handprint bloomed on Olivia's skin. Tears welled in her eyes, born of shock and pain, but she didn't cry out. She simply stared at him, her expression one of horrified vindication. The room was frozen for a heartbeat. Then Genevieve Croft, who hadn't moved a muscle, spoke her voice, cutting through the silence with icy clarity. "Thank you, Jonathan," she said, reaching up to her lapel and clicking the top of what looked like an ordinary fountain pen. A tiny red light went dark. "We have that on video, and I believe this deposition is over." The color drained from Jonathan Blackwood's face. He looked from the pen in Genevieve's hand to the horrified expression on his own lawyer's face. And in that moment, the master of the universe understood that he had just handed his enemy the one thing that could destroy him, the undeniable truth. The existence of the video threw the case into chaos. Walter Finch and his team immediately filed an emergency motion to have the recording deemed inadmissible. Their argument was twofold: that the recording was made without Jonathan's consent, violating wiretapping laws, and that it was an unethical entrapment orchestrated by Genevieve Croft to provoke their client. "Ms. Croft is a disgrace to the bar." Finch thundered in a preliminary hearing, his face flushed with indignation. "She deliberately goaded my client, a man under immense personal stress, into an act that is completely contrary to his nature, all while illegally recording him." The case was assigned to Judge Harrison Thorne. Thorne was a judicial institution in the city, a man nearing retirement who had seen it all. He was known for his stoicism, his sharp intellect, and his utter contempt for theatrics, legal or otherwise. He was impervious to the pressures of wealth and public opinion, a fact that made the city's most powerful lawyers deeply uneasy. He ran his courtroom with an iron will and an old-school belief that justice was not a game to be won, but a standard to be upheld. In his chambers, Judge Thorne reviewed the motion and Genevieve's blistering response. Genevieve argued that the recording fell under an exception to the consent law, as she had a reasonable basis to fear for her client's safety and was creating a record of a potential crime. She attached a sworn affidavit from Olivia, detailing years of escalating verbal abuse and controlling behavior, establishing a pattern that made Jonathan's physical outburst not an aberration, but a predictable culmination. Mr. Blackwood's nature, Genevieve wrote, is not what is on trial. His actions are. And my camera did not force his hand to strike my pregnant client. His own lack of control did. To suppress this evidence would be to reward the abuser and silence the victim, a practice this court has long stood against. Judge Thorne scheduled a hearing specifically on the admissibility of the video. The courtroom was packed. News of the alleged slap had leaked, and the case of the billionaire versus the pregnant wife had become a media sensation. Reporters filled the press benches, scribbling furiously. Jonathan sat at the defendant's table looking diminished. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a sullen anxiety. Olivia sat across the aisle, a picture of quiet dignity. She had a faint bruise on her cheek, which she had refused to cover with makeup. It was a silent testament, more powerful than any testimony. Judge Thorne entered, and a hush fell over the room. He listened impassively as Finch and Genevieve presented their oral arguments, his face an unreadable mask. After they had finished, he sat in silence for a long minute, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom, lingering for a moment on Jonathan, then on Olivia. "Mr. Finch," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded absolute attention. "You argue that your client was provoked. Let me ask you a question. If a man is goaded into robbing a bank, is he any less a bank robber? If a driver is annoyed by a pedestrian and runs them down, is he any less guilty of assault? This court is not a kindergarten playground where one can claim, 'She started it.' We are dealing with the actions of adults." He then turned his gaze to Genevieve. "Ms. Croft, your methods, while effective, sail dangerously close to the wind of ethical impropriety. You should be mindful of that." He paused again, letting the weight of his words settle. "However, the fundamental purpose of this court is to find the truth. The defense wishes to paint a picture of Mr. Blackwood as a benevolent if stressed husband, and of Ms. Hayes as a scheming gold digger. The evidence in question speaks directly to the true nature of the relationship and the character of the individuals involved. It is of paramount relevance. Therefore, he declared his gavel, hovering over its block. The motion to suppress is denied. The video will be admitted into evidence, and we will watch it. Now." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Finch slumped in his chair as if punched. Jonathan went rigid. A court officer dimmed the lights and set up a large monitor facing the jury box and the judge's bench. Genevieve handed the pen drive to the clerk. The video began. The quality was remarkably clear. The audience saw the conference room, heard the tense, legal exchange. They heard Genevieve's soft, cutting words, and then saw Jonathan's horrifying explosion. They saw him rise, heard him roar his threats, and then they saw the slap. The raw, brutal violence of the act. The sound echoed in the silent courtroom just as it had in the conference room. The video ended with Genevieve's calm voice saying, "We have that on video." The lights came up. The courtroom was utterly still. Several members of the press looked shaken. A juror, a middle-aged woman, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Olivia was crying silently, not looking at the screen, but at her hands, which were folded over her belly. Judge Harrison Thorne stared at Jonathan Blackwood, his eyes blazing with a cold fire that seemed to burn right through the billionaire's expensive suit. In that moment, everyone in the room knew that the divorce settlement was no longer the main issue. Jonathan Blackwood was not just on trial for his marriage, he was on trial for his soul, and the verdict was already coming into focus in the unblinking eye of the court. With the video admitted as evidence, the divorce trial was for all intents and purposes over. Walter Finch's carefully constructed defense had been demolished by a 10-second clip. The proceedings transformed from a contentious battle into a grim exercise in damage control. Finch quickly pivoted, advising Jonathan to offer a massive settlement, hoping to make the rest of the ugliness disappear into a sealed private agreement. They offered Olivia the Penthouse a lump sum of $50 million and $500,000 a year in child support. It was a king's ransom, an attempt to buy her silence and make the public relations nightmare vanish. Jonathan, chastened and humiliated, sat silently through the negotiations, his usual arrogance replaced by a haggard weariness. He had been publicly shamed, and he just wanted it to be over. But Genevieve Croft and Olivia Hayes were not finished. In the final hearing before Judge Thorne, Genevieve stood and rejected the offer. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the courtroom. "Your Honor," Genevieve began her voice, steady and clear. "My client is grateful for Mr. Blackwood's newfound generosity, and we will of course be seeking a substantial financial settlement to ensure the security of her and her child, a child Mr. Blackwood has shown little concern for, beyond his status as an heir. But this case is no longer just about money." She walked slowly toward the judge's bench. What happened in that conference room was not a private marital dispute. It was an act of violence and domination by a man who believes his wealth and power place him above common decency, above accountability, and above the law. Mr. Blackwood has spent a lifetime cultivating a public image as a philanthropic pillar of society, a brilliant innovator, a family man. This image is a lie. It is a shield he uses to hide the bully and the tyrant beneath. She gestured toward the press benches. If this ends with a quiet, sealed settlement, what is the message? The message is that justice can be bought. That if you are rich enough, you can strike your pregnant wife and then simply write a check to make it go away. The only thing Mr. Blackwood fears more than losing his money is losing his reputation. The only punishment he will truly feel is the public dismantling of the lie he has so carefully constructed. Genevieve proposed her own terms, a financial settlement of $75 million to be placed in a trust for Olivia and the child. Full sole custody of the child for Olivia with Jonathan, allowed only supervised visitation, pending anger management therapy and a psychological evaluation. And then she delivered the final shocking request. "We ask that the court compel Mr. Blackwood to issue a full public apology, not a press release written by his lawyers, but a televised statement in prime time on a major network. An apology to Olivia, admitting what he did, and an apology to the public for the fraudulent image he has sold them." Finch shot to his feet. "Outrageous, unprecedented, Your Honor. This is a mockery of the judicial process. You cannot compel speech. This is a vindictive, personal crusade." Judge Thorne held up a hand, silencing him. He looked at Genevieve, then at Olivia, and finally his gaze settled on Jonathan for a long, uncomfortable time. The judge was a man of the law, a man of precedent. What Genevieve was asking for was radical a step far beyond the normal confines of a family court ruling. He called for a recess. For 2 hours the courtroom waited on tenterhooks. When Judge Thorne finally returned, his face was grim set like granite. He sat, adjusted his robes, and the room fell into a deep silence. "I have considered the arguments from both sides," he began, his voice resonating with authority. "The financial and custodial arrangements proposed by the plaintiff are, in light of the evidence, presented fair and just. I award Ms. Hayes full legal and physical custody of the unborn child. I award her the sum of $75 million. Mr. Blackwood will be granted supervised visitation rights only after completing a court-mandated program for domestic abusers." He paused, looking directly at Jonathan. "As for the matter of the public apology, Mr. Finch is correct. It is unprecedented. Our system of justice is built on financial restitution, and in criminal cases, the deprivation of liberty. It is not typically in the business of compelling contrition." Finch allowed himself a small, relieved smile. "However," the judge continued, his voice hardening, "this is not a typical case. The evidence before me shows a man who has used his vast public platform and wealth to create a persona that is a dangerous fiction. This fiction grants him power and influence, and he used the power of that persona to intimidate and control his wife. The slap seen on that video was not just an assault on Ms. Hayes, it was an assault on the truth. The greatest injury inflicted upon Ms. Hayes beyond the physical was the systematic erasure of her own reality, her own worth replaced by the grand narrative of Jonathan Blackwood. Justice in this case requires more than a transfer of funds. It requires a restoration of truth. It requires accountability in the same forum where the deception was perpetrated, the public square. His final words fell like hammer blows. Therefore, I am ordering Mr. Jonathan Blackwood to deliver a public statement to be broadcast live. He will not be given a script. He will on his own address his actions in that deposition room. He will apologize to Miss Hayes by name. He will acknowledge that his behavior was violent, unacceptable, and an abuse of his power. The network date and time will be determined by the court. This is not a punishment for his soul which I have no jurisdiction over. It is a remedy for the public deception he has actively engaged in. This is my judgment. He struck the gavel. The sound cracked through the stunned courtroom. Walter Finch stood his mouth agape. Reporters scrambled for the doors. Olivia Hayes put her head in her hands, and for the first time let out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. Justice had been served, and it was going to be televised. The week leading up to the televised apology was a media circus of unprecedented scale. Judge Thorne's ruling was debated endlessly on every news channel, talk show, and social media platform. Legal scholars argued over its constitutionality, with some calling it a brilliant stroke of restorative justice, and others a dangerous judicial overreach. The court designated a national news network, WBN, and a time slot, Wednesday at 8:00 p.m., a prime time spot usually reserved for blockbuster shows. The event was billed simply as the Blackwood Statement. Jonathan Blackwood was a ghost. He holed up in his penthouse, the drapes drawn, refusing all calls except from his lawyers. His company's stock took a nosedive as investors panicked. The board of directors held an emergency meeting, and rumors swirled that they were moving to oust him as CEO. The empire he had built on an image of unflinching control was crumbling because he had for one moment lost it completely. Olivia, meanwhile, retreated to the quiet sanctuary of her new life. Shielded by Genevieve from the relentless media requests, she focused on her health and her baby. She and Penelope took walks in the park, bought a crib, and painted the small nursery a soft, hopeful yellow. She felt a profound sense of unburdening, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She decided she would watch the broadcast, not for revenge, but for closure. She needed to see it to truly believe she was free. Wednesday night arrived. Millions of people across the country tuned in. In her small apartment, Olivia sat on her couch, a cup of herbal tea in her hands with Penelope beside her. The broadcast began. There was no fancy set, no interviewer. It was just a single stationary camera focused on a simple chair against a neutral grey backdrop. Jonathan Blackwood walked into the frame and sat down. He looked like a different man. His expensive suit seemed to hang off his frame. His face was pale and gaunt, the confident swagger replaced by a deep, hollowed-out exhaustion. For a full 30 seconds, he just sat there, staring into the camera lens, the silence amplifying the tension across the nation. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy, stripped of its usual commanding tone. "Good evening," he began, his eyes fixed on the camera, but seemingly looking through it at something far away. "My name is Jonathan Blackwood. By order of the court of this state, I am here tonight to address my actions on the morning of October 14th. He swallowed hard. "During a legal proceeding, I physically assaulted my wife, Olivia Hayes. I slapped her across the face. She was and is pregnant with our child." He paused, and for a fleeting second, a flicker of the old defiance crossed his face, a twitch of a muscle in his jaw. but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a stark, empty resignation. "There is no excuse for what I did," he continued, his voice flat. "It was not a momentary lapse. It was the culmination of years of behavior in which I used my position, my wealth, and emotional manipulation to control and diminish a woman I claimed to love. The world saw me as a great man, a builder, a leader. But in my own home, I was a tyrant. What the camera captured was not an aberration. It was the truth." He looked down at his hands, then back up at the camera. For the first time, his gaze seemed to connect. It was as if he was speaking directly to Olivia. "Olivia." He said her name, sounding strange and foreign on his lips. "I am sorry. For the slap. For the years of quiet cruelty that led to it. For making you feel small so that I could feel big. For seeing you as a possession instead of a partner. I failed you as a husband, and I failed our unborn child as a father. I am sorry." He spoke for another 2 minutes, his words stark and unadorned. He acknowledged that his public persona was a lie. He admitted to his abusive behavior. There was no self-pity, no attempt to garner sympathy. It was a sterile, brutal confession. Whether it came from a place of genuine remorse or from the cold calculation of a man trying to salvage the last wreckage of his life, it was impossible to say. But the words were spoken. The truth was out. He finished, stood up, and walked out of the frame, leaving the empty chair in the spotlight. The broadcast ended. In her apartment, Olivia let out a long, shuddering breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Penelope put an arm around her. Olivia didn't feel triumph or joy. She just felt quiet. The final chain had been broken. The monster was no longer a monster, just a sad, broken man on a television screen. The aftermath was swift. The next day, Jonathan Blackwood resigned as CEO of his company. He sold his penthouse and disappeared from public life. Olivia gave birth to a healthy baby girl named Hope. With a portion of the settlement, she established the Hayes Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to providing legal aid and safe housing for victims of domestic abuse, escaping powerful partners. She went back to work, not at a gallery, funded by a billionaire, but at a small community arts center, where she could champion artists who truly needed a voice. Her life was no longer a grand spectacle. It was small and it was real, and in its quiet authenticity, she found a wealth that Jonathan Blackwood, for all his billions, could never comprehend. 2 years passed. The name Jonathan Blackwood had faded from a blistering headline into a cautionary tale, whispered in boardrooms, and a case study in law schools. The televised apology became a cultural artifact, a relic of a brief, intense moment when the private pain of one woman became the public reckoning of a titan. But for Olivia Hayes, the past was not a relic. It was the foundation stone of her new reality. She now lived in a world bathed not in the cold, artificial light of a penthouse, but in the warm morning sun that streamed through the windows of her modest but comfortable brownstone. It was a life measured in the scent of baby powder and fresh coffee, in the sound of her daughter Hope's laughter, in the satisfying weight of a day's work well done. The Hayes Foundation, housed in a renovated downtown building, had become her life's purpose. It was a place born from her own trauma, a shelter built from the rubble of her old life, and it was thriving. The foundation didn't just offer legal aid, it offered a comprehensive escape route. It had a network of therapists, financial advisors, and security experts who specialized in extricating victims from powerful and controlling partners. Olivia was its heart. She wasn't a lawyer or a therapist, but she was the first person many of the women who walked through their doors spoke to. She was living proof that escape was possible, and her quiet, empathetic presence was a more powerful balm than any legal jargon. She understood the language of fear, the shame that was not their own, the suffocating fog of gaslighting. She had spoken it herself. One crisp autumn afternoon, a young woman named Ava Petrova was shown into Olivia's office. She was barely in her 20s with wide, terrified eyes and a tremor in her hands that she tried to hide by clutching a worn handbag. She was the wife of Michael Vance, a mid-level real estate magnate known for his brutish tactics in business and his carefully cultivated image as a city benefactor. As Ava began to speak, her voice barely a whisper, Olivia felt a chilling sense of déjà vu. The story was horrifyingly familiar, a different verse of the same song she had lived. Ava, an immigrant from Eastern Europe, had met Michael when she was a student. He had swept her off her feet, a powerful older man who promised to take care of her. The caretaking soon became control. He isolated her from her few friends, telling her they were a bad influence. He held her immigration status over her head like a guillotine. He gave her a cash allowance for groceries, demanding a detailed accounting of every penny, while his own spending was legendary. He never hit her, but he didn't have to. He had constructed a prison of psychological terror, convincing her that she was stupid, incompetent, and that without him, she would be deported and destitute. "He tells me I am crazy," Ava whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He moves my keys, my wallet, and then yells at me for being disorganized. He tells people I have a memory problem. Last week, he cancelled my credit card, and when I couldn't pay for groceries, he called me a disgrace in front of the entire store. He said he does it to help me learn responsibility. But I feel like I am disappearing." Olivia listened, her heart aching with a shared memory. This was the insidious nature of the abuse she had endured, the slow, methodical erosion of a person's soul. It left no visible bruises, no broken bones for a camera to capture. How do you prove that someone is stealing your sanity? Genevieve Croft, who now served as the Foundation's chief legal counsel, joined the meeting. Her sharp eyes assessed Ava with a mixture of professional concern and compassion. They took the case, of course, but Genevieve was grimly realistic in her private assessment with Olivia later that day. "This is not your case, Olivia," she warned, stirring her tea in the Foundation's small kitchen. "We don't have a smoking gun. There is no video of Michael Vance being a monster. In public, he's a saint. On paper, he's generous. His lawyers will paint Ava as an ungrateful, unstable immigrant trying to scam a wealthy citizen. It's his word against hers, and he has a much, much bigger megaphone." Genevieve was right. The initial legal skirmishes were a brutal lesson in asymmetric warfare. Michael Vance's law firm, a pack of snarling litigators, even more aggressive than Walter Finch, had buried them in an avalanche of motions. They demanded Ava undergo an intense psychological evaluation, claiming she had a history of delusions. They subpoenaed her college records, her family back home, anything they could twist into a weapon against her. They offered a pittance of a settlement contingent on her signing a non-disclosure agreement, so restrictive it would essentially erase her from Michael's history. Ava grew more terrified by the day, the legal process itself becoming another tool of his abuse. Weeks turned into a grueling month. Olivia watched Ava begin to wilt, the spark of hope that had brought her to the Foundation sputtering out. She saw herself in the young woman's eyes, the exhaustion, the creeping belief that maybe the abuser was right, that fighting was futile. The memory of her own despair in the days before she left Jonathan was a cold knot in her stomach. She had won because of a lucky break, Jonathan's hubris, Genevieve's foresight with the pen camera. But what about all the others like Ava, whose abuse was just as real but left no physical evidence? One night, unable to sleep, Olivia sat in the dark of her living room, watching the city lights. Hope was asleep upstairs, safe and loved. But Ava was in a small, secret apartment, funded by the Foundation, jumping at every sound. The injustice of it was a fire in her blood. She realized then that her fight had not ended with Jonathan's apology. That was just the first battle. The war was here now in this quiet, desperate struggle. She finally understood that the greatest weapon she possessed was not the money from her settlement, but the story it had bought her. Jonathan had inadvertently given her a platform, and she had a duty to use it. The next morning, she walked into Genevieve's office with a look of fierce determination. "We're fighting this war on his terms in courtrooms where he can bleed us dry with paperwork," Olivia said, her voice low and steady. "We need to change the battlefield." "What are you suggesting?" Genevieve asked, leaning back in her chair, her eyes narrowed. "I'm going public," Olivia stated. "Not with Ava's name, not with Michael Vance's name, but with the story, the pattern. I'm going to give an interview, and I'm going to describe in detail the insidious, invisible tactics of coercive control. I'll use my own experience as the frame, and I'll talk about the work we do here. I will describe a hypothetical case of a young immigrant woman being psychologically tormented by her powerful husband. People will connect the dots." Genevieve was silent for a long moment. "That is an incredibly risky move, Olivia. Vance will know you're talking about him. He could sue us for defamation. He'll double down on his attacks on Ava. You'd be painting a target on her back and on the Foundation's." "It's already on her back," Olivia countered. "Right now, we're hiding in the trenches while he lobs grenades at us. It's time we fired back. The only thing men like Vance and Jonathan fear more than the law is the light. Let's make this so public that he can't bury it." It was a gamble, a high-stakes play that could either save Ava or destroy her. But looking at the resolve in Olivia's face, Genevieve saw not a reckless victim, but a savvy strategist who had learned from the best and the worst. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, let's burn him down." Olivia chose her platform carefully, an in-depth interview with Brenda Walsh, the same respected journalist who had covered her divorce trial with a rare degree of nuance and fairness. The interview was broadcast a week later. Olivia was poised, articulate, and powerful. She recounted her own story with a raw honesty that was captivating, but then she seamlessly pivoted. "My case was unique because of one piece of undeniable evidence," she said, looking directly into the camera. "But I'm here today to talk about the victims whose suffering is invisible, the abuse that leaves no mark on the skin, but shatters the soul. It's a calculated campaign to make a person doubt their own mind, their own worth. It's controlling every penny, every friendship. It's threatening someone's immigration status. It's convincing a vibrant, intelligent young woman that she is crazy and worthless. This is happening right now in our city to women who have no video to prove it." The interview was a bombshell. The phrase coercive control entered the public lexicon. The Hayes Foundation was flooded with donations and calls from other women sharing similar stories. As Olivia had predicted, the media began to buzz, speculating about which of the city's powerful men fit the profile she described. Michael Vance's name began to surface on social media threads and in gossip columns. The pressure worked. 3 days after the interview aired, a woman contacted the Hayes Foundation. She was a former executive assistant at Michael Vance's company. She told Genevieve a story backed up by emails and documents she had saved of how Vance had systematically cheated foreign investors using fraudulent paperwork and shell corporations. More than that, she confirmed that he often boasted about his control over his young wife. It wasn't the proof of domestic abuse they needed, but it was the chink in his armor. It was the key to his own brand of gilded cage. Armed with this new evidence of financial crimes, Genevieve had the leverage she needed. She didn't file it in court. She sent a copy directly to Michael Vance's lawyers with a simple 2-sentence note. Your client's predatory behavior is a pattern that extends beyond his home. Settle with Ava Petrova fairly and quietly, or this goes to the district attorney and the New York Times. 2 days later, Michael Vance agreed to all their terms. Ava was granted a divorce, a generous and uncontested settlement, and her citizenship application was fast-tracked with no opposition. That evening, Olivia stood at the window of her daughter's bedroom, watching Hope sleep in her crib, her small chest rising and falling in the soft glow of the nightlight. The victory felt different this time. It wasn't about her own survival. It was about wielding her scars as a shield for someone else. She had not just escaped the gilded cage. She had learned how to dismantle it bar by bar for others. The pain of her past had not vanished, but it had been transformed. It was no longer just a source of suffering, but a source of strength, a beacon for others lost in the same darkness she had once known. And that she knew was a freedom Jonathan Blackwood could never take away. The story of Olivia Hayes and Jonathan Blackwood is more than just a shocking headline. It's a stark reminder that abuse of power often hides behind the most polished and respected facades. It shows that immense courage can be found in the quietest acts of defiance, a secret phone call, a copied document, the will to say, no more. Judge Thorne's unprecedented verdict sparked a national conversation, forcing us to ask what true justice looks like. Is it merely financial, or does it demand a public reckoning with the truth? Olivia's journey from a gilded cage to a life of authentic purpose is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. If this story of courage, justice, and redemption moved you, please honor Olivia's fight by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone, and subscribing to our channel for more true stories that matter. What do you think of Judge Thorne's ruling? Was it justice or judicial overreach? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice is part of the conversation.